Daniel chapter 6. Now, last week we did the first half of Daniel chapter 6. It was a cliffhanger. So I encouraged you not to read ahead so you wouldn't know what happened. But Daniel was put into the lion's den at the end of last week's message. How many of you read ahead? How many of you know how the story goes? Okay. Well, for those of you who don't, we're going to look at the second half of Daniel chapter 6. So this is going to be part 2. And we'll start with this picture again. I just love this picture. So this is the Lion of Judah, portrayed by Aslan from C.S. Lewis' series, The Chronicles of Narnia. And that's just a series that I really loved. When my children were young, I think I read the whole series to them about 3 or 4 times at bedtime. But a quick review. We're going to take a quick review of part 1. This is from last week, the beginning of chapter 6 in Daniel. And we had the handwriting on the wall. Actually, that takes us back to chapter 5. But it was at that time that Belshazzar, he was the final king of Babylon. And he was actually a co-regent. He was a co-ruler with his father. And his father really doesn't enter into the picture in the book of Daniel, but he was the co-ruler with his father, and so he was the one that God gave this message to, this handwriting on the wall. He was terrified. Everybody with him was terrified. This was at a banquet that he was throwing, and he was using all of the articles, the vessels from the temple, from God's temple, the first temple that was built by Solomon. And so, God said, this was just the last straw for you. The kingdom of Babylon is going to be removed from you, and it doesn't end well for Belshazzar. So, he, at the request of his mother, the direction of his mother says, you've got to bring in Daniel. Daniel is somebody who can make sense of this handwriting on the wall. So he calls for Daniel, and he knew about Daniel. He just ignored him. Belshazzar was not in a good place with the Lord. And so he calls in Daniel. He offers him the third spot. He could be the third ruler of the Babylonian Empire with him and his father if he can make sense of this handwriting on the wall. Just a very short little message. And so Daniel says, I don't want anything you have to give me. It's not going to be worth anything in a very short amount of time. And so Daniel goes on to explain that this is telling him that God is bringing an end to his rulership and to Babylon as an empire altogether. So at the end of this, Belshazzar, he recognizes, okay, Daniel gave the true message here. Maybe I can appease God, and I'll just give Daniel this third spot as ruler of the Babylonian Empire. And last week we asked the question, how long did this new position as co-ruler last for Daniel? It was a great position, right? Right at the top. Well, we figured probably no more than a few hours. So guys, do we need to reposition this mic? No. Okay, so it's your fault. Okay. You own it. All right, so Daniel's got this position for just a few hours, and then it says at the end of chapter 5, it says, on that very night, Belshazzar of the Chaldeans was slain. The Chaldeans being another name for the Babylonians there. But he was slain that very night. And so Darius, it's interesting, different historical accounts say Darius was the one who came in to Babylon, kind of snuck in through the Euphrates River, which flows through Babylon, and others say Cyrus. So it says Darius the Mede and Cyrus the Persian. And there's a lot of debate about, who the two of them were. In fact, there's a very good case that's made by some, including Josephus, by the way, that say that they're the same person. And there's something that you have to kind of reinterpret in the book of Daniel to make that work, but it really it's a good explanation, and we really don't know for sure. That's the bottom line. There are certain things that we don't know. So here we have again, we're reviewing from last week, the beginning of chapter 6, and it says, "So Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Now, one of the reasons why some historians think that Darius and Cyrus were the same person, even though one's described as a Mede and the other's described as a Persian, is that by all accounts, Cyrus would have been 62 at this time as well. So that's just one of the pieces of evidence there. But here we have in verse 2, Darius, he appoints 120 satraps. These were governors, administrators of all of the provinces within the Persian Empire. And you remember last week we talked about the fact that by the time we get to the events of the book of Esther, we have 127 provinces. Daniel was one of 3 administrators who were over all of them. And they reported directly to the king, to King Darius. Now, Daniel was not only part of the 3 top administrators, he was the top of the 3 administrators. So he had that top position already under the king. It's amazing to think about, though, when you think about the life of Daniel and just how amazing he really was and how God used him. And a little bit further on in the book of Daniel, when Gabriel comes to him, he says, you are beloved of God. You are precious and valued in God's sight. So, Daniel just had this amazing relationship with the Lord, and the Lord, because he was so faithful, God was able to use him in amazing ways. And so, within the Babylonian Empire, Daniel raises, he rises to that top position within the Babylonian Empire under King Nebuchadnezzar. And then he kind of falls into semi-retirement when Nebuchadnezzar is no longer with them. And under Belshazzar, he's kind of brought out of retirement for a short time. But then shortly after that, Darius, the Persian, and they're enemies with the Babylonians. Darius, he understands that Daniel is so trusted that I can bring him in as a top administrator in my administration as well. So it's just amazing, the testimony here for Daniel. He rises, and then if Cyrus is a separate person, there's evidence that he also thrives within the administration of Cyrus as well. But Daniel, rising to this position, he was always in danger of the jealousy of the other counselors to the king. And so we have, and we saw this last week, there was a conspiracy against Daniel. They wanted to entrap him. They wanted to find fault with him first. They couldn't find fault with him. And so they said, well, maybe we can entrap him because he's so faithful to the law of the God of Israel. And so we're going to find a way. And they do. They conspire together, and Daniel ends up in the lion's den. By the way, that question at the end there, how would you react? How would you react if all of a sudden you had people who were slandering you, assassinating your character, they were falsely accusing you of things, and you end up in a life-threatening situation because of it? What would be your reaction? Just as a believer in Yeshua, what would be your reaction to this? Would you react with faith? Would you react in the sense that, God, this is part of God's plan, God is with me, God can deliver me? Or would you say, what have I done wrong? How did I get here? Or I put my trust in God and this is what happens? And really, we can go either way. As we have to be careful. We have to really examine our faith continually in our circumstances. And it may not even be as dramatic as being threatened with a lion's den, or threatened with a fiery furnace, or threatened with death if you can't interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Daniel was at least twice now, his life was in danger, not having anything to do with anything that he did, nothing that he did wrong. He was still beloved of God. He just continues to be faithful and to do what he normally does, as we'll see in our review just in a minute. But I want to take a little detour here. And we could do a whole session on this, on the Magi and how they fit into the Babylonian Empire and into the Persian Empire, and I'm going to try to do it in 5 minutes. So if you have a clock or a watch or a phone, Magoi to Magi. Magoi to Magi. This is a group of administrators, counselors, priests, and administrators. They have varied roles here, multi-roles, in the Persian and the Babylonian court, advisors to the king, the Magi. And so in order to get to this term, we actually see this in the book of Daniel, but also, the book of Daniel, when in chapters 4 and 5, as you see referenced there, that's in Aramaic. And Jeremiah 39:3 and 13, if you look that up, that of course is in Hebrew. So it's Rav Mag. Rav Mag, Rav being, being chief, we'll translate that as chief. It's typically translated as chief of the magicians, only because it looks like that, but that's not really a great translation. It's in the Aramaic, it implies chief of the Magi. And in order to get to the term Magi, you have to go through several languages, Persian to Aramaic to Greek, and then a Latinized form of the Greek term, and there you have in both the Latin and the English, Magi. You have that term there. So that's how we get to that in the English translations. But the Magi it was a hereditary Persian priesthood, is what they were. Okay, so hereditary. Now, Daniel, he doesn't fit into that. As a matter of fact, part of their accusation is, we have this guy who is an exile from Judah. That's how they describe him. In other words, he's not one of us, really. But Daniel was the one who was in charge of the Magi. He was put in charge of the Magi under King Nebuchadnezzar, this Jewish exile from Judah. Now, what was the Magi's primary skill? Think about your New Testament story, and it's okay to be wrong. You can you shout it out, and then I'll tell you you're wrong. So the typical answer would be astronomer or astrologer, which are two different things, by the way. Astrologer, astronomer, and both of those are wrong. Okay, the primary skill is dream interpretation. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Something that Daniel is kind of known for, isn't he? So the Magi, that was their primary skill, and why they were part of the advisors to the kings of Babylon and later in Persia as well. And by the way, of course, we see the Magi come into play in the New Testament as well, the Brit Hadashah. So we know that their legacy, it extends even to the 1st century. And by then, the Persians, there was this Parthian empire, kind of a mini empire within the Babylonian Empire, and they were actually at war with the Romans quite a bit, and successfully at times as well. So they were really a thorn in the side for the Romans. We'll get to that as we look at the Brit Hadashah in just a moment. So the Magi, they were appointed priests and advisors within the king's court. also the Magi had a lot of power amongst themselves as well. It was the Magi, because they were both priests, and they were priests over the official, especially for the Persian Empire, the official religion of the Persian Empire, and this was designated by one of the Dariuses. And so they had the power to select the Medo-Persian king as well, and this extended through the generations. So they were powerful. These were part of the accusers of Daniel. No small group here that was really kind of setting him up here and trying to entrap Daniel. Okay, so here we have from the Brit Hadashah, Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. After Yeshua was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of King Herod. Now, King Herod, of course, he was kind of putting himself in the place of the king of Israel. He was actually put in place by the Romans, but he was not a descendant of David. He was not a legitimate king over Israel. And he was always in a precarious position. He always had to worry about people wanting to take him out, being in a position of trying to find favor with the Romans, keep favor with the Romans, and trying to get favor with the people as well. So he's the one who built, or I should say, modified and expanded the second temple that was very magnificent, even at the time of Yeshua. So in the days of King Herod, Magi from the east. Now, what is the tradition? How many of the Magi were there who came to see Yeshua? Three. Wrong. Most likely wrong. Okay, the only reason why we have that tradition, I think, is because there were three gifts, three types of gifts, right? So, but it really doesn't say how many. It's interesting, in the Eastern tradition, Eastern Orthodoxy, the tradition is there's 12. So there are different traditions, but there could have been many. There could have been many. And again, these were Parthians. They were Parthians, and they were often at odds with the Romans. Now, Herod, of course, is put in place by the Romans, and so he's kind of wondering, what are these guys doing here? And they would have come with a lot of pomp and circumstance. It's not just like, these three guys just came in stealth, and we just want to see Yeshua, and then we'll be gone. Okay? No, they came in with a lot of pomp and circumstance, possibly with a military garrison as well, just to protect them. So there could have been many of the Magi at this point who came. So, in the days of Herod, from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews?" And you wonder, wow, these Magi from the east, from the area of Persia, for the Parthians, why are they asking about someone who is born to be King of the Jews? And how is that going to sit with Herod, who is a power-hungry person anyway, trying to protect his kingship? But it also says, well, as we read on, where is the one who was born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. So, first question here is, why is Herod and all Jerusalem upset about the Magi being there? Because that's the indication. When it says all, when I say all Jerusalem, it really wasn't all Jerusalem. We saw at the birth of Yeshua that there were those who were waiting for the redemption of Israel. They were waiting for the Messiah to appear. And you remember there was Hannah, who was in the temple, this older woman who was praying day and night at the temple, and she recognizes that Yeshua is that Messiah. And then there was Simeon or Shimon, who was at the temple as well, and he recognizes, this is the Messiah. now I can die. Now you can take me, Lord, because I've seen you are Messiah, the King of Israel, who you've sent to redeem Israel, to restore Israel. It was just amazing. And then it says that they were telling other people who were waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. They told others, we've seen the Messiah. So it wasn't, but when it says all Jerusalem, when it indicates that all Jerusalem was kind of in an upheaval over this, over the arrival of the Magi, it's because not everybody was happy about the prospect of the Messiah, and even those who were a little bit concerned because they recognized, well, this Messiah, he's going to be at odds with the Romans, and this is going to be a really interesting time. Could be war. So they were. Is my 5 minutes up, by the way? Yeah, I thought so. According to Daniel chapter 2 and 7, the Roman Empire would be the final empire before the everlasting reign of Messiah. Okay, so think about that. We talked about this when we were looking at chapter 2, and then in chapter 7, we're going to be looking at this as well. The 4 kingdoms, the 4 Gentile empires, and this constitutes the times of the Gentiles. Remember that term, that phrase that's used in the Gospels. It doesn't say time singular of the Gentiles, it says times. So you have these 4 empires that are specified there. The Roman Empire, the Jewish community recognized the Roman Empire is the last one. So the Messiah can come anytime. And there's other reasons from the book of Daniel that many people said this is the time. This is the time when the Messiah is going to come. So now you have these Magi who Daniel was over. He had authority over them. And now these Magi have come asking, where is he who was born King of the Jews? And so Herod, wanting to protect his kingdom, but not letting people know that he really wanted to kill this child, so that he wouldn't become king, he inquires of all the religious leaders. He says, where is this Messiah supposed to be born? And they, of course, they quote from the Tanakh, from the Hebrew Scriptures, and they say, in Bethlehem. That's just a couple miles outside of where they were in Jerusalem. Bethlehem is where he's going to be born. Which, by the way, is derived from a midrash, not just the pashat of the Hebrew Scriptures. So don't just, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The midrash can come in handy sometimes, even for historical data. So they're recognizing the next kingdom after the Romans is going to be this everlasting kingdom of Messiah. And so, it says that they were following this star, right? And they'd been following it for a couple years. We don't know. A lot of people speculate that, this was some kind of star in the sky that, they triangulated and they found, that it rested over Bethlehem. We really don't know. It seems to be something very supernatural, but and something probably more immediate than just a star billions of miles or billions of light years away. And then the term worship, I just wanted to mention, really briefly here. We don't really know for sure. The Christian translations, pretty much across the board will render this as worship him, which is kind of interesting because, one of my pet peeves is, in the Brit Chadashah, when it is often translated worship, it really should be prostrate, to prostrate oneself. And that's done, you can see the, well, that's interesting. So that proskuneo, it should be proskuneo if we're going to transliterate it. I actually had the Hebrew or the Greek letters there, and we apparently don't have the Greek font. So it came out as a somewhat accurate transliteration there, proskuneo, in the Greek, which means to prostrate oneself before either God or a king or a very important person. And then yishtachu or yishtachave, shacha, various forms of the word to prostrate oneself in the Hebrew as well. And we see, for instance, Abraham prostrating himself before Avimelech, who was the king of the Philistines. And so it's not always used in terms of worship of God. And I only mention that because it's really not until after the resurrection of Yeshua that anybody really recognized the deity, the divinity of Yeshua. So it's a little premature, to think of him being worshipped, except in this case, it may be a little bit different because there's indications in the book of Daniel that the Messiah is deity, is divine. And why? Because, and we'll see this as we go on in the book of Daniel, because the Messiah is seen as sitting on the throne of God, with God. So nobody sits on the throne of God unless they're deity, right? So this may have been something that these magi were aware of. So I don't want to discount the phrase worship in this case. They may have known a little bit more or a little bit more clearly than even the Jewish people in Jerusalem who were studying the Tanakh as well. Because you'll remember, even after Yeshua's death, they described him as a prophet, a great prophet. His disciples, so again, his divinity was really being revealed kind of bit by bit. But so anyway, that's just a little side note on that term for worship. And when you see that, just to be careful when you see that in translations, that before Yeshua's resurrection, they really didn't know about his divinity at that point. But here, the Magi may have had a little insight. So why was Herod and all Jerusalem upset? According to, so I think we've covered this this slide here. So here, this is revisiting a little, one of my favorite PowerPoints that I put together earlier. And this is a representation of the image in Nebuchadnezzar's dream that's described in chapter 2, but also described in chapter 7, which we're going to get to in the following weeks. And Rob is going to be taking that. Good luck, Rob.
Pray for me.
Pray for him, he said. So this image here, you can see the head of gold and then the silver as you go down, the bronze. So the silver indicates the Medo-Persian Empire that follows the Babylonian Empire. Bronze indicates the Greek Empire, which follows that. It's divided into 4, and you see that in chapter 7 more clearly. And then the Roman Empire, which now we get to the time of Yeshua. The Roman Empire's been in power for a little bit of time before Yeshua arrives, but the Roman Empire is supposed to be divided as well, 10 kings, and then what happens? Well, a stone appears, and the stone represents Messiah. And that stone, it strikes the image at the feet, shatters it. And then, after it shatters, all of these empires are destroyed. And then, you see the stone, it becomes a mountain itself, which is symbolic of being a kingdom. And what happens with that kingdom, that mountain, it fills the entire earth. Okay? So, that represents the kingdom of Messiah, the everlasting kingdom of Messiah. Of course, there's a lot of other details that we're not going into. But Matthew chapter 2 here, it's an amazing account, and we're only getting a brief look here because I want to do it all within 5 minutes. So what did the Magi want? What was their purpose? What were they coming to seek in Jerusalem? Specifically, the Magi wanted to acknowledge the king whose kingdom would fill the earth, whose kingdom is without end, the king who would rule over all kings, including the Parthian king, the king that they would have established as part of the Parthian kind of mini kingdom at this point. So this is really a diplomatic mission. That's why there could have been many magi, and there could have been a military garrison that accompanied them as well into Jerusalem. And of course, everybody in Jerusalem, including King Herod, is worried about this. So back to Daniel. In verse 4, and again, verse 4, this is according to the Jewish verse numbering. In parentheses, you have the Christian verse numbering, which is only one verse off throughout this chapter. Now, this Daniel was distinguishing himself, which is still part of our review from last week. He was distinguishing himself among the supervisors and satraps because he had an extraordinary spirit in him. So God had empowered him. You remember, you'll have to listen to last week to, how this is explained, what this means to have an extraordinary spirit within him. But the Holy Spirit, was filling him, empowering him for his job, for his ministry. He was an administrator and a ruler of kinds as well. So God had put an amazing spirit within him, not only to administrate, but also to be faithful. He was faithful. There was nothing that could be found in him that they could bring a charge against. So the supervisors and the satraps, this conspiracy that was starting to take place, they tried to find ground for a charge against Daniel, but they were unable to find fault or corruption because, why? Something that we really would like to have said about all of us as well. Because he was trustworthy and no negligence or dishonesty could be found in him. Amazing testimony. All the supervisors of the realm, the magistrates and the satraps, ministers and governors have all agreed. Okay, they're talking to King Darius now. They're saying, all of us, the magistrates, the satraps, the magistrates, by the way, that comes from the term that later is described as the Magi. All of us, the satraps, ministers, and governors, have all agreed that the king should issue an edict. So they're falsely implying that Daniel is in agreement with this as well. But he's conspicuously missing as they all come as a group before the king. So now this conspiracy begins. And there's an interesting idiom here. And the idiom is true both in the Aramaic and the Hebrew, just slightly different in the languages there. And we'll look at that in just a moment, but there was this conspiracy against Daniel. So the idiom, just to describe this, is when you're talking about falsely accusing somebody, it's literally described as devouring the flesh. That's how it looks in the Hebrew. In the Aramaic, it's even a little bit more descriptive, devouring or eating the pieces of a person. Now that's very descriptive. And within Judaism, I mean, just the whole idea of slander, character assassination, false accusations against somebody, this is considered the worst thing that you can do to a person. It's really akin to murder. We actually see that in the book of James or Yaakov, where he describes that as well in similar language. It's interesting, even in Jewish thought today, when somebody is slandered or their character is assassinated, they're falsely accused of something, it says that 3 people are murdered in the process. 3 people die in the process. Right? So obviously the one who's being slandered, but then also the person who's doing the slandering, or in this case, the people who are doing the slandering. And then the third is an interesting one as well. This is one that we really have to be careful about. The person who hears and receives the slander is killed in the process as well. So, in other words, we have a responsibility not just to receive without checking it out, without, and sometimes we just have to ignore it. If we hear slander or we hear accusations against a person, if we don't know if those accusations are true, sometimes we just have to filter it out. If it's something that we need to check out, then we need to check it out. But otherwise, we are, according to the thought here, we're killing ourselves as well just by receiving the slander. So 3 people, the person being accused, the people doing the accusing, and the people who receive the slander as well. Very, very serious. But we're going to see, just how that idiom plays out here in the narrative. But here we also see the faithfulness of Daniel to God. We see how faithful he is, because as it says in verse 11, it says when Daniel learned of the edict, what did he do? He panicked, right? He panicked, and then he says, I got to change my practices, I got to change my ways, I got to do things more in secret, or I could be in big trouble. No, there's no indication of that at all. No panic, no concern, no worry. It just says that he goes back to his home where he has a window facing Jerusalem. He kneels down 3 times a day and prays toward Jerusalem, toward the area where the temple once stood as well, that was destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar. And so he continues to do this 3 times a day, as if nothing had happened. He knows about this edict. He doesn't change a thing, which is pretty amazing. And, by the way, we talked about it last week. What was the content of his prayers as well? It was confessing the sins of the fathers of Israel, who sinned against the Lord. It resulted in the exile. He's confessing the sins of the people, and he's praying for the restoration of Israel. Now, those prayers are continued to this very day, 3 times a day. And it's in Hatfilah, the prayer, the central prayer of Judaism, which is also referred to as Shemoni Esrei, the 18 benedictions, but also as the Amidah. Now, what does the Amidah mean? What does Amidah mean? It means standing, which is very ironic because you can see how traditions change over time, because here it describes Daniel as kneeling 3 times a day. Same content as what we find in the Amidah in terms of praying for the restoration, praying repentance for the Jewish people. Same content, but in Daniel's time, they were, and most likely this was a tradition that many people followed, not just Daniel, but they kneeled. And then the Amidah means to stand. So eventually the tradition came where it was the standing prayer as well. You would always stand for it, and you do to this day. So the officials of the king, Daniel's accusers, they said to the king, this is after the edict has been put in place, this is after they have come as a group to witness Daniel breaking the law, breaking this edict in order to worship God. They come to King Darius and they continue this slander against Daniel. And they say, Daniel pays no attention to you, O king, or to the decree that you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. Now, as we saw last week, this edict, according to Medo-Persian law, once that edict is put in place by the king, it cannot be reversed. It cannot be undone. So this is big trouble. Now they know they have Daniel. They've entrapped him. And now they're bringing their accusation before the king. And so they say, Daniel is not heeding your edicts, your decisions, and he's still praying 3 times a day, which is against the edict for 30 days, if you remember. So the king, when he heard this, he was the only official, the king was the only official who had a hard time with this. You know, he was grieved, and he was probably very upset with himself for being manipulated in this way to make a decree that Daniel had to violate because of his faithfulness to God. So Darius, like Nebuchadnezzar, by the way, we see a lot of parallels here between Darius at this point and Nebuchadnezzar, as we're going to see as we continue on in chapter 6. When he heard this, again, the Aramaic, the Hebrew idiom for a false accusation or slander, eat the pieces of. That's that Aramaic rendering. And by the way, in the Aramaic, it does say that. And this is one of the reasons why I tend to dislike some of the modern translations, because a modern translation would simply, you know, say, well, they accused him, they slandered him. They wouldn't give the actual idiom. And so I think, you know, we miss out when we don't see the underlying idioms, you know, and there are some translations that are more literal than others that would actually give the idiom. So I think we miss out if we're only relying on some of the modern translations which attempt to interpret the idioms that we see in the scripture. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense to you. So what I'm saying is, I'm not saying that you shouldn't consult with some of the modern translations, but find some of the more literal ones as well and compare them. Because not only do you get what some would say a kind of a wooden translation of the scriptures, but you get a more literal translation, and you get used to the actual idioms that are in the original language. So it's worth it to at least compare what you're reading to a more literal translation. So, to eat the pieces. Now, why is this significant? And we see this, by the way, you know, if you want to look this up, Psalm 27, verse 2, we see that idiom in Hebrew, where it says, when evildoers come upon me to devour my flesh. What does that mean? And some of the modern translations will not give you that kind of wording. You know, they'll try to interpret that. But to devour the flesh, to devour my flesh, evildoers have come upon me. Well, it's slander, it's false accusations, it's character assassination. This is something that David experienced. False accusations against him. My adversaries and my enemies, they stumble and fell. They stumbled and fell. That's the amazing thing. His accusers, David's accusers, they ended up being the ones who stumbled and fell. Why? Because God was with David. And so, you know, that's part of I hesitate to call it a promise, but God, when he is with us, he can turn the tables. Yes. When there's slander against us, he can turn the tables so that those who accuse us are the ones that stumble and fall, and not us. So we need to keep on trusting in the Lord. Amen? Amen? Okay, very important, but very encouraging. It also, now through this idiom, and this is kind of what we're getting at here, is that there's an eye for an eye kind of retribution here. Yeah, in other words, the punishment that was meted out against Daniel now comes back to those accusers, those advisors to the king, including some of the magi, who were accusing David, falsely accusing Daniel. I'm sorry. An eye for an eye. Now, your mind is probably going, Torah, Brit Hadashah, Yeshua's teachings, and so forth. The idea behind the eye for an eye in the Torah is different than what we have throughout the ancient Middle East. Now, some of you are familiar with the Code of Hammurabi. That was a code that was in place a little bit before the time of the Torah. And it talks about an eye for an eye, but it talks about it very literally. And so, and you can see this amongst the Persians as well. But an eye for an eye in the scriptures it's a maximum punishment. In other words, it says, a person who does something against somebody else, that they should receive up to that same punishment, but not beyond it. So in other words, it was a limit. It was putting a limit on the punishment, which was not true of other codes, legal codes of that time, at the time of the Torah. So it was really an innovation within the Torah of God. But the Persians took it very literally. And we see, even within the Persians today, which are mostly Islamic, and throughout Islam, really, around the world, there tends to be a very literal kind of interpretation and application of this concept of an eye for an eye. In fact, in some recent cases in Iran, literally some people's eyes were put out because, in one case, there was a struggle between two people, and the person, one of the people, blinded the other, and so as punishment, that person had their eyes put out by the Islamic court. So, the tendency is to take things very literally. We see this in stoning and things like that. Very, very violent, very cruel, and not something that the Torah had in mind. Very important to make that distinction today. In verse 9, "Now, O king, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it may not be altered according to the law of the Medes and the Persians," kind of backtracking a little bit here, "which cannot be repealed." So this is the type of edict that was put in place. And of course, they were able to entrap Daniel, to bring this accusation to the king. So thereupon, King Darius, he issued the written decree, which was a huge mistake on his part, and one that he regretted. In verse 15, when the king heard that it was Daniel who had violated the decree, he set his mind on how he might rescue Daniel. In other words, he was looking for a loophole. He was looking for a way to get around enforcing this decree against Daniel, because Daniel is going to end up in a lion's den if he can't find a way around this. And it says that the king struggled with this until nighttime. And then at night, that was it. He had to, in that very day, he had to enforce his decree. So the king ordered that Daniel be thrown into the lion's den. Now the king spoke to Daniel, saying, "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." Now it's starting to sound a bit like Nebuchadnezzar. Remember? Nebuchadnezzar had seen God at work, both in Daniel and in his friends Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael. Nebuchadnezzar saw those miracles. King Darius, he had heard about these things, and no doubt had gotten to know Daniel so well that he was ready to put Daniel over the entire kingdom. He is regretting his edict. And so this is kind of his prayer. And after he says this to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you," then the king fasted from food, water, and entertainment. No music, no entertainment, that's the nature of a true fast. Anything pleasurable you abstain from. So in verse 19, which comes to the end of last week, isn't it great that we've finally finished our review? Then the king went to his palace and passed the night fasting. No entertainment was brought before him, and he was unable to sleep. So the question is, who slept better, the king or Daniel? Ironically, it's probably Daniel. Now, I want to mention here too that, as we go through Daniel, it's going to become more and more prophetic, in terms of the content of the book of Daniel. And there is a prophetic insight to Daniel's situation here. What was Daniel really trying to avoid here when he was in the lion's den? He was trying to avoid the mark of the beast. I'll give you a little time to catch that. Yes. That's my only attempt of humor this morning, okay? Now it's this afternoon. But I love these pictures. I showed these last week. Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel just doesn't look like he's concerned at all. He's just facing down these lions, and they look kind of ferocious. Although a couple of them are cowering a little bit. But they look pretty ferocious. He looks pretty calm and confident here. It says, Daniel will later say, an angel, God sent his angel to protect him from the lions. The lions, I'm just kind of thinking, I'm getting in their mind, and they say, we're starved, but somehow we can't bring ourselves to make you our dinner. And they really were. That would be what they would do with the lions. They'd make sure that they're very hungry and they're ready to pounce on whomever is put into that den. Another picture here. The lions look a little bit too friendly here, but we're going to see that they're not very friendly to others who are put into the den. And one last picture here. Daniel, again, the reason why I like this is because, Daniel, there's no indication that he was fearful or worried at all. Even if they had pounced on him and killed him, if this is how God wants to end my life, I'm in my mid-80s, I've had a good life, I've fulfilled the ministry that God has called me to, except God had called him to even more. There's even more that's to come in Daniel's life. So, verse 20. Now we're into this week's text. Aren't you glad? And we get to finish the cliffhanger. At dawn, the king arose and hurried to the lion's den. And as he reached the den, he cried out to Daniel with a voice of anguish. Now, this is the king who was really praying that, may God deliver you from the lion's den, but which took a little bit of faith to even think that God might deliver him. This is not something that happens in the lion's den. But still, the king was unable to sleep. He was fasting all night, praying that a miracle would happen. And so with a voice of anguish, he cries out to Daniel. And the king spoke out to Daniel saying, Daniel, servant of the living God, was your God, whom you serve continually, able to rescue you from the lions? He's hoping against all odds for a response from Daniel. Daniel spoke to the king, may the king live forever. He hears the response, and you can imagine, just the spine-tingling response, within the king. May the king live forever. My God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths so that they haven't harmed me, because I was found innocent before him. Nor have I committed any crime against you, O king. So this is God's way of saying, Daniel, you're innocent. You haven't done anything wrong against me or against the Persian king. I'm not going to take the time in that second bullet item. Innocent before me, there's a reference to 1 Timothy 2:15. It's an obscure reference. There's a great midrash that explains this. Have you ever wondered what Paul meant that in childbirth that the woman will be saved? Has everything to do with what Daniel just said there, but it takes a long time to explain, so I'm not going to do it. If you want to ask me later, you're welcome to do that. But just keep that in mind. There's a good explanation for that. And it has nothing to do with God requiring women to bear a child in order to be saved. That's the good news. So in verse 24, then the king was overjoyed, and he ordered Daniel taken up out of the den. So Daniel was lifted out of the pit. No injury of any kind was found on him because he had believed or exercised faith in his God. And we'll see there that the words all stem from aman, which was faith, and whether it's believe or trust, although trust is kind of a different word, even though some translations use that word. But believed, he exercised faith in God. At the king's command, those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, remember, who had eaten the pieces of his flesh, is the idiom. They were thrown into the lion's den. They, their children, and their wives, they had not even reached the bottom of the pit before the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones to pieces. So here you have the use of the word pieces, and it's not in a lot of the modern translations. I looked. So again, if you don't have a literal translation, you don't get the word pieces, but it's there in the Aramaic. And, bless you, it's there. And what happened? The lions devoured those who were thrown into the pit. Their bones were broken to pieces, and the lions devoured the pieces. So in other words, it's kind of God's retribution. It's God's eye for an eye in terms of Daniel's accusers. You see the idiom there? So, again, Daniel exercised faith in God. And again, whether God was going to deliver him from the lions, if that was going to be the end for him, he had faith in him and trusted him. And King Darius saw that. But God did deliver him. And this is so important. It's a point, I think Rob made this point earlier in the book of Daniel, that it's not always for us to pray that God takes us out of the circumstance. We might be, again, in a very serious situation, a very difficult situation, a struggle. People might be coming against us. God doesn't necessarily want to take us out of the circumstance. He wants to give us victory in the circumstances. Amen. Right? So, yes, amen. And this is exactly what happened with Daniel. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He didn't, he accepted his circumstance of being put into the lion's den. Same thing with his three friends. They accepted the circumstance of being thrown into that fiery furnace. And they had the testimony, God is able to deliver us from that fiery furnace. But even if he doesn't, we're going to be faithful to our God. And that's the attitude we always want to strive for, is I'm going to be faithful no matter what my circumstances are, no matter what I'm thinking. God, why are you putting me into this circumstance? Or why are you bringing these things against me? We always want to strive to have faith in him, to trust him through our circumstances. Sometimes he'll take us out of it. Sometimes he will take us through it. But there's always victory. No matter what happens, there's always victory. Then King Darius, this is verse 26. You can see we're coming to the end here. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages dwelling in all the earth, may your peace abound. Now what is this sounding like? This is sounding like Nebuchadnezzar, right? In chapter 2. No, actually, chapter 3. All of chapter 3 in Daniel is Nebuchadnezzar testifying before the entire kingdom. But in this case, Darius is actually making an edict. Remember, an edict that can't be broken, throughout all of the kingdom of Persia, the empire of Persia, Medo-Persian Empire. And he's saying, you need to respect the God of Israel. And you need to recognize his greatness. And here's what he has to say. He writes to all the peoples, nations, and languages dwelling in all the earth, in other words, the known world of the Medo-Persian Empire. May your peace abound. Same wording as Nebuchadnezzar used. I issue a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, people are to tremble with fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. He's recognizing the enduring kingdom of God here. His kingdom will never be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He delivers and rescues. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. The difference, of course, when we look at chapter 3, and Nebuchadnezzar is making this testimony before the known world and throughout the empire, the Babylonian Empire, is that he had just come through this ordeal of his own. But here, Darius is seeing God's protective power for Daniel, that God can be trusted. And that's what we want other people to see in our lives, right? That's why we don't always want to be delivered from the circumstances, because we want people around us to see God's faithfulness, that he is able to deliver us and to draw people to the Lord. And people are watching us. They're watching our lives. So he delivers and rescues. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and the earth. He delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. Now that has kind of a double meaning here. Remember our idiom. He literally delivered him from the lions and in the lion's den. But the power of the lions, that's also an idiom for those who slandered him. So God delivered him from those who slandered him, and there was retribution. There was punishment for those who slandered him. And by the way, I didn't address the fact that the wives and the children were also put into the lion's den along with the slanderers. That was not God's law. That was Persian law. Okay, so don't confuse that. I don't have time to go into the passages there. But the Torah itself and the prophets, and they all testify that the children are not to suffer the punishment of the parents. Now, there are consequences for future generations if the children and the grandchildren don't repent. But the key is we repent not only for ourselves, but also for the sins of our parents, for the sins of our grandparents, for the sins of our community. Okay, that's how we undo, those residual punishments that even come upon us because of our ancestors. That was my brief explanation without actually sharing the scriptures with you. Chapter 3. Much like Darius' proclamation, as I mentioned, that was Nebuchadnezzar. The entire chapter, I encourage you to go back and read that, the testimony of King Nebuchadnezzar to his entire empire. So Daniel, this is the very end here. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Okay, so remember how I said, that you can make a good case for the two of them being the same person? Now, in this translation, and in most translations, it doesn't sound like they're separate, right? But it can be translated in such a way that it's basically clarifying who Darius is. That could be just a title. Cyrus could be the name. And so, Medes and Persians, that can be explained as well. So the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. I'm not saying that that's the case, but there is a lot of scholarly debate about the identity of Darius and whether he was identical to Cyrus the Persian. So a little preview for next week. There's going to be a different teacher, the one that ask for your prayers. The preview for next week, it's going to be a look back at Babylon. So remember, not all of the book of Daniel is in chronological order. Okay, so it's going to take us back to the reign of King Belshazzar. He's the one that God communicated to with the writing on the wall. So, but he was a co-ruler of Babylon along with his father. Daniel had a dream during his reign, and the vision passed through his mind as he was in his bed. He wrote down a summary of the dream, and that's how the next chapter begins, kind of going back from the Persian Empire back to the Babylonian Empire, not in chronological order. But another important thing as you're reading through and studying on your own, because really one of our goals here is to inspire you just to have a love for the Word and to read the Word on your own, and to really dig into this. So the first 6 chapters here, it's narrative, as you've already seen. But then the next chapters 7 through 12, are prophetic. And so it's going to take on a much different character. So that was Daniel, verses 20 through 29. From a conspiracy against Daniel, to the lion's den, to God's deliverance of Daniel. Let's all stand together. Okay, let's have a word of prayer here. Avinu Shabashamayim, our Father who is in heaven, Lord, you have warned us that in this life we will have tribulation, but that Yeshua has overcome the world. You have instructed us to be courageous, to have peace in you, and to realize that in our greatest challenges and most uncomfortable situations, you show yourself to be mighty. You revealed the secret things to Daniel. You strengthened Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael to stand firm in their faith when they stood before Nebuchadnezzar and faced a fiery furnace, a fiery death. And they were confident that you could save them. Daniel had peace with the hungry, starving lions and was delivered by your angel. And Lord, may you show yourself mighty when we are slandered and devoured by the accusations of others. You are mighty to save, and we trust in you, B'Shem Yeshua. And we all say, Amen. Amen.